Now, the plight of migrants trying to get into Europe has highlighted the sheer scale of the refugee problem facing the world's governments. The United Nations say there are 50 million refugees, half of whom are women and children. That's more than the entire population of South Africa. Amnesty International say the refugee crisis is worse than it's ever been. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, there are currently estimated to be around 3 million people fleeing from conflicts in South Sudan, Central African Republic and Burundi. Well, I'm joined in the studio by Hugo Tristram from the British Red Cross, who is the development officer in the charity's refugee support area and is involved in Refugee Week, which aims to highlight the plight and the contributions of refugees around the world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us there. 50 million people who are homeless and stateless on the move. That's the equivalent of the entire population of a country. How have we got to this situation?
Well, the reasons why people migrate are very complex, and they're almost as varied as the number of people that are migrating. So I could give you maybe 50 million reasons. But the most obvious reasons why people migrate and flee countries is they're fleeing a combination of things. They may be fleeing environmental disasters or humanitarian disasters. They may be fleeing earthquakes. They may be fleeing starvation, famine, drought. They may also be fleeing war, generalized conflict. So, for example, one of the countries of origin for a lot of refugees, certainly who are currently making a crossing in the Mediterranean, from fleeing the Syrian civil war. There are a lot of people from Syria. They can also be fleeing persecution, so they may belong to a minority that is being persecuted or being targeted either by the government or by other agencies. So it's a complex mix of reasons. And
Amnesty International says the refugee crisis, to quote them, is one of the defining challenges of the 21st century, and says the response of the international community has been shameful. Are they right to be that scathing?
Well, I think that they're right that it's one of the major issues of our time, and I think it's a complex issue. I think there are a lot of countries. Of course, one of the things that we need to remember is that you open the item with the conversation about the discussions in Europe. I need to emphasize that those 50 million migrants aren't all coming to Europe. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them are not in Europe. They're in places like Pakistan, they're in places like Lebanon, they're in places like Turkey, that are doing doing their level best to help people who've fled conflicts in countries.
So what would you like to see governments do, and NGOs, for example, but mostly governments? What more do you want to see governments do?
I think, well, all governments that are signatories to the UN Convention need to take those responsibilities seriously and give people shelter who are fleeing persecution. So Europe has a responsibility to do that, to provide protection to people who reach Europe. I think in terms of it's hard to say how to address the root causes. You need to look at ways to resolve conflicts. You need to look at ways of development.
But obviously those conflicts are taking place now, so something needs to be done. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about Europe, but it's the distribution of asylum seekers and refugees that's being proposed in Europe, isn't it? I mean, because you can't really have quotas for refugees, and you probably know this more than we do. You don't have you're not supposed to have quotas for refugees and asylum seekers, because asylum is an international obligation for all countries around the world under the Geneva Convention.
No, that's right. No, that's absolutely right. And to that extent, you can't have quotas. I think what the EU discussion is about distributing the number of applications in Europe. So it's really because Italy and Greece are under an enormous amount of pressure in terms of the arrivals, especially from Libya, because they're in their geographical locations. So they have a huge numbers of people arriving in those two countries. And currently the protocol in Europe is that Greece and Italy should process those applications,
right,
which puts a disproportionate pressure on them to deal with those claims.
Well, we'll talk about that more in a minute, so just stay with us. Saturday, June 20th is World Refugee Day, and I know the Red Cross is involved in that, and that one of the aims is to counter the negativity that people feel when they hear the words refugees or asylum seekers. Let's have a look at what Refugee Week is all about.
An umbrella parade walked through the streets of London to kick off Refugee Week, ending up at the Celebrating Sanctuary event on South Bank.
Refugee Week is all about celebrating and promoting the contributions of refugees and trying to create spaces of encounters where different communities can come together, learn more about refugees, their experiences, and perhaps find different ways of relating to those experiences.
I think we've seen the benefits that different cultures can bring to Britain, and just being here today we've seen completely different foods, different music, and everyone's just together and celebrating the fact that people can come here and just really feel involved and feel part of Britain.
Refugee Week was all about positivity and celebrating the sanctuary that Britain provides. However, there is a risk that cuts to services that support refugees and migrants, such as English classes for speakers of other languages, will hinder integration and threaten future contributions.
Speaking English already was an advantage for me because I could after a while I could understand people, I could communicate with them and make myself understood. I've met a lot of people from different backgrounds, asylum seekers and refugees who are stuck at home because they fear that they could not be understood by people.
In a recent workshop on integration, communication and becoming British, knowledge of the English language was argued to be vital for refugee and migrants.
Well, communication is important because it allows you to function in the society. It allows you to make friends. When you get that letter from the job centre, you'll be able to read it yourself and you'll be able to understand it.
Marks & Spencer's was co-founded in 1884 by Michael Marks, who was brought to the UK as a Jewish refugee.
Fish and chips were brought to the UK by Jewish refugees expelled from Portugal in the 17th century.
Patex and Tilda Rice were founded by refugees from East Africa.
So this is how refugees brought a difference to the UK.
And of course, Hugo Tristram from the British Red Cross is still with us. You saw in that video, the point they were actually making was that refugees who arrive in a country have historically brought real benefits to the host communities. Is that the case?
It is the case. I mean, obviously, there is always an exception, but in the overwhelming majority of refugees do bring and contribute a huge amount.
So let me ask you this then. What is it about refugee and migrants and so on, refugees, that is proving to be so controversial in the European Union?
It's a good question, and actually what Refugee Week is about trying to address is that they're always seen as a problem. We always talk about the migrant problem, the refugee problem. And Refugee Week is really about trying to actually talk about the upside. And there is a huge upside. There is a huge amount that refugees contribute. I think it's true to say that at first, when they first arrive, they're obviously very vulnerable and they do find it difficult to find work. But as time goes by, they look for work, they get work, they have children who contribute to the society and become active contributing members of the countries that they arrive in.
Well, the point, of course, is that Europe is, all the countries in Europe are arguing with each other at the moment. We'll have to see whether or not there will be a cohesive way forward on this. Hugo Tristram from the British Red Cross, thank you very much indeed.